Hi. After the binding of Isaac, where do our characters find themselves, both in the story and also for the audience? Depending upon how we understand Genesis to be written, as I'm looking at it here in the time of exile or right after exile with the question of restoring Jerusalem. And I want to keep both those things in mind, both the mood and experience of the characters in the story, specifically now Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, but also the audience as we reach what I call transition tales. As you can see in this little chart here, the passages from 22:20 to 25:18 before we get to the Jacob story. Because one of the aspects of Genesis as it's constructed is there is no Isaac story. There's the Abraham and Sarah story, and we'll have a story of Isaac and Rebekah. Of course, we'll have the long story in chapter 24, the wooing of Rebekah. But there are very few stories about the life of Isaac and Rebekah together, mostly in relation to their sons Jacob and Esau, as we'll see in chapter 27 especially. So why is that? Well, we can't ask the authors why they left something out. But there are a number of aspects of how these chapters are written that give us some hints. And one of those is how they don't seem to fit together exactly. They have a variety of genres. For example, the little genealogy here of Milcah's children, and we'll see another one of Ishmael's children, as you see here on the chart on the right, and the death and burial of Abraham, which mysteriously Isaac and Ishmael share in participating in, and we'll have to look at that there and ask about that. But also a number of very confusing geographic situations. For example, let's note here that we saw at the end of our last scene that they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba, presumably with the men who came with him. But as we're going to find out momentarily, Isaac settles here in Beer Lahai Roi. Beersheba's here, so a substantial distance away, whereas Sarah will die up here in Hebron, also known as Mamre, also known as Kiriath Arba, and we'll look at that issue in a minute. So the family is broken up. And I'd like to just stop and consider for a moment, where is Abraham at this point in the story? Because the focus is on him. As we'll find out in a few verses, Sarah is dead, and we won't hear anything directly from Isaac until the end of chapter 24, when Rebekah comes down off her camel and Isaac brings her into his mother's tent, Sarah's tent. And we'll have to ask the question then, where exactly is Sarah's tent, and why is Sarah's tent still there after she's been dead for some time? But we'll get there when we get to the end of chapter 24. So there's a number of these confusing elements. Let's look and see what it implies about cities here. So there's two aspects of this here. At the top is the question of the cities in chapter 23, where Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. And we'll see at the end of the chapter, we're told Abraham buried Sarah's wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. But why Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, and is it Mamre, or is it Hebron, or is it Kiriath Arba, and why all three? We'd heard earlier they were settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, which made it sound like they're two different things, but now we see them equated with this new name, Kiriath Arba, which we'll see here, and then we'll see this whole phrase of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan, but not necessarily mentioning Kiriath Arba or Hebron every time, so there's something very confusing going on there about place. In chapter 24 and following, we'll see that Abraham sends his servant to Aram Naharim, to the city of Nahor, who's one of his brothers, along with Haran. And yet we see a number of ways that the city is called. So they left Haran after their father Terah died after his father Terah took them there. Terah died after they had left. He lived to be 205 years, and Abram was only 75 at the time and lived to be 175. So Terah lived substantially in Haran after Abram and Sarai and Lot left. But that's not the issue so much here as what is the place called, and is it one place or multiple places? So we are told that Terah died in Haran, and Abram took his wife and sons, and they went in Haran and set out for the land of Canaan. And Abraham sends his servant to Aram Naharim, which we don't hear about elsewhere, but then we're told later that Isaac married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padam Aram, not the same as Aram Naharim. Then we're told in chapter 27 that Jacob is told to flee to my brother, which would say his mother Rebekah's brother, in Haran. Is Haran the same as Paddan Aram? Is that the same as Aram Naharim? And then we see it being Paddan Aram the rest of the way. And yet we'll also see that Jacob is in Beersheba, which of course is in the land and not in The old country, which we see back here, the map showing Aram, Naharim, Padam, Aram, and Haran there in relation to these places down here where Beersheba is at the other end of this journey. So there's a lot of confusion there about place and a lot of confusion about names of places, and people are scattered and spread out. And I'd like to suggest that this is intentional. It's intentional that readers experience the confusion that we experience, for example, in looking at this element of Rebekah's lineage, and I'll look at this more closely in a little bit here. But notice this description all the way back in chapter 11. The name of Nahor, one of Abraham's brothers, woman, was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. What? Now, if we stop to think about that, we can realize it's simply saying Haran is her father, and it's saying it twice. But why put it that way? And what reader, whether in Hebrew or in English, could read this the first time and not go, what? I'm confused. I'd like to suggest the confusion, and there are other aspects of confusion we'll look at here later, both in names and places, is intentional, so that readers can have the experience that Abraham is having, as well as the experience that perhaps the audience, either in exile or coming out of exile into a demolished old country where the Persians are sponsoring them to rebuild Jerusalem, and yet the leaders under Ezra and Nehemiah are saying, you can't be married to foreign women, you have to only marry people within the family. And yet here's a story of Abraham. Who could he marry within the family? And you will see that his brothers married people very close within the family. So I'd like to suggest that the confusion we experience around names and places and things is meant to give us a similar experience to what the audience had with the confusion of post-exile. Where is home? The Persians now use the name Yehud for what they used to call Judah. Are we going home to Yehud or to Judah? Is it going to be Jerusalem or something else? That same confusion is what we might experience in the text, of a sense of dislocation and disconnection, and a need to try to reestablish new connections, whether those are with the people in the old country or other people, to have there be a future. There's another aspect of this I'd like to look at from Abraham's perspective. How might he be feeling at this point? Let's go back and look at this chart that I've showed earlier about promises by category. This is not all the promises. I have a much longer chart that we've looked at with the promises throughout from chapter 12 to 24 and the repetitions of them. But I just want to see the various categories and see where is Abraham and where are we at this point. Promise to be a great nation. Well, that's not happened. Promised to be the ancestor of many nations. No, that's not happening yet, at least as far as he knows. We'll find out, and we've already found out, that Ishmael will be the father of many nations, but Abraham hasn't heard that. To have many seed or offspring like the stars in the sand, well, so far he's got exactly 2, and both of them are gone from him as far as he knows. To be blessed, well, I guess it depends on what you think blessing is. I've been exploring throughout that blessing in Genesis means fertility and life, and yet here he is alone, with no children and no wife and no land. How does that make him a blessing for others? The only others he's around right now are the other men who came with him part of the way to not sacrifice Isaac, and they're simply servants, so we don't know how he might be a blessing for them or for anybody else. To have a son, yes, but what's happened to the sons? To acquire land, all you can see, this land, all of Canaan, and Abraham at this point has exactly 0 land. And to possess the gates of your enemies, just a couple of verses earlier, after as a promise after the binding of Isaac, didn't happen, and that obviously hasn't happened either, and will be promised again at the end of chapter 24, and it still won't happen. So none of these promises have been fulfilled. And how might Abraham be feeling now, many, many decades after he first heard the call back in chapter 12, to leave everything behind and listen to this voice and go and be a blessing? We don't hear how Abraham feels, though, but before we get any farther, we're going to see another insult to him. So I don't want to get into too much of the detail today. I really want to focus on the overview, but we'll at least look at a couple of verses to get some sense of what's going on. So let's look just right now at these couple of verses that follow right after this and see what our authors are doing in either writing it this way or shaping the tradition this way. So immediately right after this, we haven't heard a word about Sarah, and we don't hear a word about Isaac. Now, after these things, and as my note here has about the genealogy of Nahor, and the note from Wen and below, I'm not going to get into too much because he's arguing for its proper place here against older scholars who would see all this as redactional editorial material because they can't see how it fits together. And rather than look at it from different sources, which it may be, I'd like to suggest exactly how this fits together, as I've been doing in this series and my other series as well. So after these things, establishing a sharp break there, and we see that phrase is used back in chapter 15, and then we'll see it way later in chapter 39. It was told Abraham, by whom? In this nice passive voice here, it's a rare stem of this word here, 24 times of 372 times in the Hebrew scripture for this in this rare stem. But who is it? And it's Menachem Perry who wrote a beautiful piece on Genesis 24 that we'll use as a tool, along with his for decades long writing partner Meyer Sternberg, who back in the early 90s also wrote a long, beautiful piece on Genesis 24. We'll use both of those. He notes here this announcement that Milcah has borne children to your brother Nahor, a whole bunch of them, and he notes, what greater mockery could there be than this? That after he's labored and waited for one child and then another, and now the children seem to both be gone, meanwhile your brother is just fertile as can be. But we have to ask, who is conveying this message? As far as we know, the only people Abraham is in any contact with are the young men who are with him. And this message has to come from where Nahor is, back in the old country, as we saw here. Back up here, from here all the way back down to where Abraham is here. How would that message have come? This is the path that Abraham will send his servant on in chapter 24, but how in the world would a message have come from here all the way back here to find Abraham in this particular moment? There's no way to know that. It's very strange. But what we hear is also strange. Milcah, a woman here, and we can look at the family chart here to keep track of things. I have to keep it small to keep it off the map and the other elements, but hopefully you can see that there. Milcah, the wife, has also borne children to your brother Nahor. And this is a really unusual situation, and Milcah is mentioned a number of times. Let's put back Rebekah's lineage so we can see the magenta of Milcah all over the place here. Back in our earlier genealogies, whether in chapter 5 of Adam and Eve, the further genealogy with Shem, etc., or in the Table of Nations in chapter 10, never are the women mentioned. It's just simply the men, one after another, begat so-and-so and begat so-and-so. We don't even hear about daughters except with very rare occasions. But repeatedly we hear about Milcah has borne children to your brother Nahor, or Milcah, the woman of Nahor, which I translate rather than wife, since the Hebrew doesn't have a word for wife. Notice how many times here, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. And yet not always, but almost every time. So that's a really unusual thing to focus on Milcah. Why? Well, we don't know, but we'll have to consider that as we go, and we will. And then there's this whole list of names, and most of these are meaningless for our purpose. I won't go through all of them. A couple of them, as you can see here, are place names, but the others don't mean much of anything as far as we know, or they're related to words. But suddenly we hear Bethuel. And so here's a list of all of them in Bethuel, who became the father of Rebekah. But where's Laban? And so central to the story in chapter 24 and also to Jacob's story is his uncle or brother Laban. And yet he's not mentioned here. We simply hear as a summary, these 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Forming a little chiasm here, as you can see, repeating it here and framing it around the names of the children. And yet no Laban. Why would there be no Laban? So we hear Rebekah mentioned here, and we discover she becomes Isaac's second cousin, as Rachel is Jacob's second cousin. She's a generation younger than Isaac is. And as Sternberg notes below, juxtaposed with God's blessing in verse 17 and placed in structural correspondence to Ishmael's marriage, the report virtually names the bride-to-be. But if we didn't know that already, we might not have noticed that there, and it was hidden there. Just as we look at this chart all the way back at the end of chapter 11, we saw the hints of this here. Now let's go back and look at that one for a minute, just to see how confusing this all is. So we heard earlier that Terah was the father of 3 boys, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And then we hear Haran is the father of Lot, but where's his wife? We don't hear any wife about him or any mother of Lot. And then we hear he died before his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans, but we don't know how old he was. We don't hear anything about his age like we do about Abraham. Then we hear that Abraham and Nahor took women or wives. The name of Abram's was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's was Milcah. And then we hear this odd thing. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Why not just say, and Milcah and Nahor bore Well, no, I can't. You see how that's so confusing there, because that's not it. Why don't we just say that Haran bore Milcah? But we don't hear it that way. It's complicated. So this is hidden back in chapter 11, awaiting our situation here, and that will set up our story. As we also look at our stories here, I want to note a couple of things that are really unusual about this section. We have a couple of these short little things about Abraham's death and burial, and one of the questions we'll have to look at there is, Ishmael and Isaac both come to bury their father. How did they know he died, and how did they know where he died, and were they in contact with each other? We hear nothing about that. Also, this strange little thing just before that about Abraham's second family, just before he dies at age 175, he suddenly has another wife and a bunch of children, although when he's buried in Machpelah, he'll be buried with Sarah and not with Keturah, the second wife. But then, amidst that, we hear two stories of negotiations with city people. And one of them is the longest story in the entire book of Genesis, and that's what we need to look at here, the wooing of Rebekah. 67 verses. The other story we're going to look at here, the purchase of Machpelah, the cave here in chapter 23, is 20 verses. We have to ask about both of those, given the relative shortness of some other stories. The Tower of Babel is only 9 verses. The crucial story of Jacob stealing the birthright from Esau is only 8 verses. The crucial call of Abram is only 4. And yet, the seemingly small detail, the purchase of a cave and a field connected with it to bury Sarah, and the negotiations with the Hittites takes 20 carefully rendered verses, and if it wasn't for people like Meyer Sternberg, we could easily miss what's going on there. So we'll look at that in detail. But after that follows the 3 times longer story of the wooing of Rebekah, where neither Abraham, other than the very beginning, or Isaac, only at the very end, or Yahweh, only mentioned briefly in passing by the narrator, but mentioned often by characters, is in the story. Where in both of these, in the Machpelah one and in the wooing of Rebekah, there's all kinds of repetition, and that's what leads people like Sternberg and Perry to highlight the role of repetition and variation on that, as well as gap filling for what's said and what's not said. And when we look at those stories, they're both very confusing stories. The purchase of the cave seems to repeatedly say, we give it to you, we give it to you, and yet there's an insisting on a price, and the high price is eventually settled on. And the wooing of Rebekah, there's great confusion once we learn how to read it over who exactly is the suitor. Is the servant the suitor, or is the servant representing someone else who's the suitor? What about the character of Rebekah, and what about Yahweh's role in that? And there'll be many things to occupy us in the amazingly long story, even longer than the flood, although this depends on where you start measuring the flood story, whether you include the postscript with Noah and his children, which I didn't, or the prescript, which I did, about people corrupting the earth. But the question isn't whether it's exactly that long. The question is, we think of the flood as a major story, and Noah's Ark obviously is a major symbol, and most school kids know about it. But how many people know about this longest story in Genesis, the wooing of Rebekah? So as we enter into this section, I hope that if you're confused as a reader, I can help dissipate some of the confusion, but some of it is just going to stay there. We can't change the fact that Laban isn't mentioned here, and he's mentioned later of where he came from. And scholars can attribute that to sources that they want, but somebody has edited it into the form we have it and meant it to be this way. So that at least will get us started to begin to follow here after. We won't look at that one verse, the further name of a concubine there, as we get into the death of Sarah and what poor Abraham is going to have to do with the wife of the dead body of his beloved wife. See you for that next time. Bye.